March 17, 1952. 10:47 a.m. Manhattan Criminal Court, Room 304. Judge Harold Whitmore sat behind his mahogany bench like a king surveying his domain, black robes pressed and pristine, gavel in hand. He'd presided over this courtroom for 12 years, built a reputation as the man who cleaned up Harlem's vice operations, who sent runners and policy bankers up the river with sentences that turned 5-year stretches into 15. The prosecutors loved him. The newspapers called him the Hammer. But what they didn't print, what whispered through Harlem's streets like smoke through a jazz club, was that Judge Whitmore had a side business. For the right price, usually 10% of weekly profits, your numbers operation could run untouched. Across him, refuse to pay, speak his name to the wrong people, and your entire organization would collapse under the weight of the law he wielded like a personal weapon. That morning, he had Bumpy Johnson in his courtroom. The gallery was packed, 200 people crammed into seats designed for half that number. Standing room only along the back wall. Spectators pressed shoulder to shoulder. Every hustler, policy banker, and numbers runner in Harlem who could get away from their corners had shown up. They knew what this was. This wasn't just another case. This was war. Judge Whitmore had been systematically dismantling Bumpy's numbers empire for 18 months, raiding policy banks, arresting runners, seizing betting slips and cash boxes. 14 of Bumpy's operations had been shut down. 23 of his people were serving time. The Italians downtown were moving into the vacuum, carving up territory that had belonged to Harlem for generations. And everyone knew, that Whitmore was being paid by the Genovese family to clear the way. Bumpy sat at the defense table in a charcoal gray suit, hands folded, face unreadable. He was 54 years old that spring, gray touching his temples, lines around his eyes from decades of calculated survival. He'd survived Alcatraz, survived Dutch Schultz, survived betrayals that would have destroyed lesser men. But this was different. This was a judge with the full weight of the law behind him, a man who could send you to prison with a signature, who could bury you in paperwork and court orders and legal maneuvers you couldn't shoot your way out of. The courtroom felt heavy that morning, tension thick in the air like humidity before a storm. Spectators barely breathed. They watched Bumpy. They watched the judge. They waited to see what would happen when an immovable object met an unstoppable force. Judge Whitmore shuffled papers on his bench, not looking up, making everyone wait. A power move. Let them sit in their uncertainty. Let them understand who controlled this space. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the casual authority of someone who'd never been challenged in his own domain. Mr. Johnson, you stand accused of operating an illegal gambling enterprise, racketeering, and conspiracy to corrupt public officials. He looked up then, meeting Bumpy's eyes. How do you plead? Bumpy's attorney, a sharp young lawyer named Marcus Green who'd been representing Harlem defendants for 6 years, stood quickly. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. Furthermore, we move to dismiss, based on motion denied. Whitmore didn't even let him finish. He turned to the prosecutor, a thin man named Davidson who'd built his career on vice convictions. Mr. Davidson, present your evidence. What followed was a clinic in judicial corruption disguised as legal procedure. Every objection Marcus Green raised was overruled. Every piece of evidence the prosecution introduced, betting slips, seized without warrants, testimony from witnesses who'd clearly been coached, financial records obtained through questionable means, was admitted without scrutiny. Whitmore controlled the courtroom like a conductor leading an orchestra, and every note played exactly as he'd arranged it. In the gallery, people shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a trial. This was theater. The outcome had been decided before the gavel ever fell. By noon, the prosecution had presented 14 witnesses, policy runners who'd been arrested and offered reduced sentences in exchange for testimony, shopkeepers who claimed Bumpy's organization had extorted them, the bank clerk who testified about suspicious cash deposits. Each witness told a story carefully crafted to paint Bumpy as a criminal kingpin, destroying Harlem from within. And with each testimony, Judge Whitmore nodded approvingly, making notes, building his case for a sentence that everyone in that room knew would be devastating. But Bumpy didn't react. He sat perfectly still, hands still folded, watching, listening, calculating. See, here's what Judge Whitmore didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson. The man didn't operate on impulse. He didn't make moves without knowing exactly how the board would look 3 steps later. He'd sat through this entire morning, watched his organization get dismantled in legal language, watched his people's names get dragged through accusations, watched a corrupt judge perform justice like a stage play, and he hadn't said a word because he was waiting. Waiting for the exact right moment. Waiting for the opening that patience always provides to those disciplined enough to recognize it. At 1:15 p.m., after a brief recess, Judge Whitmore called the court back to order. He looked directly at Bumpy, and for the first time that day, he smiled. Not a pleasant smile. The smile of a man about to deliver a killing blow. Mr. Johnson, I've heard enough evidence to proceed directly to sentencing. The court finds overwhelming proof of your criminal enterprise. I'm prepared to. Your Honor. Bumpy's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife through silk, quiet, calm, but it carried. Everyone in that gallery leaned forward. Judge Whitmore's smile faltered. He wasn't used to being interrupted, wasn't used to defendants speaking out of turn in his carefully controlled proceedings. Mr. Johnson, you will remain silent until I have evidence. Bumpy stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. Evidence that I believe the court needs to see before any sentence is handed down. Evidence relevant to this case and to the integrity of these proceedings. The courtroom went dead silent. Marcus Green looked at his client with wide eyes. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't planned this moment. Whatever Bumpy was about to do, he'd kept even his own attorney in the dark. Judge Whitmore's face darkened. His hand moved toward the gavel. Mr. Johnson, I'm warning you. Financial records. Bumpy's voice remained steady. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, giving no one reason to panic, and pulled out a manila envelope. Specifically, bank records showing deposits into account number 847-3920 at First Manhattan Trust, an account belonging to Harold Whitmore. Deposits totaling $67,000 over the past 18 months. Deposits that coincide exactly with raids on Harlem numbers operations. Deposits that coincide with court dates and sentencing hearings. Deposits that tell a very clear story about who's really running a criminal enterprise in this courtroom. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was absolute. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat, where the absence of sound becomes its own presence. Every person in that gallery stopped breathing. Judge Whitmore's face went pale, then red, then pale again. His hand froze halfway to the gavel. Bumpy continued, his voice never rising, never becoming accusatory or emotional, just stating facts, cold, precise, devastating. I also have copies of meeting logs from the Genovese Social Club on Mulberry Street. Visitor logs that show Harold Whitmore, not Judge Whitmore, just Harold, signed in under that name, entering that establishment on the 3rd Thursday of every month for the past year. I have photographs of those visits. I have testimony from 3 witnesses willing to swear they saw cash change hands. I have a recording made perfectly legally on public property of a conversation between the judge and Anthony Strollo discussing payment for judicial services rendered. Bumpy walked forward slowly, holding the envelope. 2 court bailiffs moved toward him instinctively, but Judge Whitmore raised a shaking hand, stopping them. The judge's eyes were locked on that envelope. like it was a moth-clouded gun, which, in a way, it was. Bumpy reached the bench and placed the envelope down gently. Now, Your Honor, you have a choice. You can continue with this sentencing, hand down whatever punishment you've already decided on, and tomorrow morning these documents go to the New York Times, the District Attorney's Office, the State Bar Association, and every newspaper that'll print them. Your career ends. Your reputation ends. You probably end up in a cell yourself, wearing the same prison blues as the men you sent away. Bumpy stepped back, hands at his sides, no threat in his posture, just a man laying out options. Or, you dismiss these charges with prejudice. Every charge against me, every charge against my people, currently in custody on cases you've overseen. You recuse yourself from any future cases involving Harlem numbers operations, citing a conflict of interest that you'll leave conveniently vague. You announce your retirement from the bench, effective in 6 months, giving you time to exit gracefully with your dignity intact. And these documents stay sealed forever. Nobody ever knows that the great Judge Harold Whitmore was on the Genovese payroll. You get to retire as the Hammer, the tough judge who cleaned up vice. Your legacy stays intact. Your freedom stays intact. The courtroom remained frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. This was the kind of moment people would talk about for decades. The day Bumpy Johnson walked into a courtroom with no weapons except truth and intelligence, and brought a corrupt judge to his knees without raising his voice. Judge Whitmore stared at the envelope. His breathing was audible now, quick and shallow. His career, his freedom, his entire life contained in that manila folder. He was trapped, completely, utterly trapped. And the beautiful, terrible thing about it was that Bumpy had laid the trap so carefully, so patiently, over 18 months, while Whitmore had been dismantling Bumpy's operations. Bumpy had been documenting every dirty dollar, every secret meeting, every moment of corruption, building his case, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. You can't, Whitmore's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. You can't bring evidence like this. This isn't proper procedure. This is leverage, Your Honor. Bumpy's voice remained calm, almost gentle, like he was explaining something simple to a child. This is what power actually looks like. Not a gavel, not a robe, not the ability to send people to prison. Real power is having what someone needs right now. What you need is for that envelope to stay sealed. I'm the only person who can give you that. So the question isn't about legal procedure anymore. The question is, what are you going to choose? Judge Whitmore looked out at the gallery, 200 faces staring back at him. Harlem's witnesses, every one of them would remember this moment, would carry this story forward, would tell it in barbershops and policy banks and late-night card games. The judge who thought he was untouchable. The man who tried to bury Bumpy Johnson and ended up burying himself. Minutes passed. Felt like hours. Finally, Judge Whitmore's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured tire. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. All charges dismissed, with prejudice. He cleared his throat again, louder now for the court reporter. All charges against Ellsworth Johnson are hereby dismissed with prejudice. All related charges against affiliated defendants are also dismissed. This court is adjourned. He stood abruptly, grabbed the envelope from his bench, and walked toward his chambers. No closing statement, no explanation, just retreat. The moment the chamber door closed behind him, the courtroom erupted, not in cheers or celebration, but in an explosion of voices. Shock, disbelief, excitement, fear, respect. The gallery surged forward, everyone wanting to talk, to process what they'd just witnessed. Bumpy turned to Marcus Green, who stood with his mouth open, legal pad forgotten in his hand. Bumpy straightened his tie, buttoned his suit jacket. We're done here. Marcus, send the bill to my office. Bumpy, when did you... That evidence. Where? 18 months, Marcus. 18 months of patience. That's the lesson here. You want to know how to beat power? You outthink it, you outlast it, you wait for the moment when you have something they need more than they want to destroy you. Then you make them choose. Bumpy walked through the gallery. People moved aside, creating a path. Some reached out to touch his shoulder, his hand. Old women whispered blessings. Young runners looked at him with something approaching awe. This was more than a legal victory. This was a demonstration, a teaching moment. Everyone in that courtroom had just learned what intelligence looked like when it went to war with corruption. Outside the courthouse, Harlem's sunlight hit the street in golden streams. Lenox Avenue was alive with its usual afternoon energy. Cars honking, vendors calling out, music drifting from open windows. Bumpy stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness. A small crowd had gathered outside, word spreading fast the way it always did in Harlem. The verdict had been announced to the streets before Bumpy even left the building. A young man pushed forward from the crowd. I couldn't have been more than 20, wearing a brown jacket and a cautious expression. He stopped a respectful distance from Bumpy. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Thomas. I run numbers on 132nd Street. Or I used to, before the raids. Before Whitmore shut everything down." Bumpy looked at him. Saw himself 30 years earlier, young, hungry, trying to navigate a world built to crush people like them. "You still got your corner, Thomas." "Yes, sir, I kept it. Didn't let nobody else take it, even when there was no operation to run." Bumpy nodded. "Tomorrow morning, you'll get a visit from my lieutenant. He'll bring you books, slips, everything you need to start running again. Your corner's yours. Keep it clean. Keep it honest. Remember that the people who bet with you are your neighbors. They're trusting you with hope. Don't betray that." Thomas's face lit up. "Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I won't let you down. I know you won't." Bumpy's voice softened slightly. "You know why I know that. Because you held your corner. When everything collapsed, when there was no money in it, you held your position. That's loyalty. That's what matters. Not the money, not the power, the loyalty." Within 72 hours, every one of Bumpy's policy banks that Judge Whitmore had shut down reopened. Every runner who'd been forced off their corner came back. The Genovese family pulled their people out of Harlem, quiet and quick, because everyone understood now that the territory was protected. Not by guns, not by violence, by something more dangerous. By intelligence. By a man who played chess, while everyone else played checkers. Judge Harold Whitmore announced his retirement from the bench 3 weeks later, citing health reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. The newspapers ran respectful profiles about his years of life service, his tough stance on crime. Nobody mentioned the manila envelope. Nobody talked about the bank accounts or the meetings on Mulberry Street. The truth stayed buried, just as Bumpy had promised, because Bumpy Johnson kept his word always. That's what separated him from the corrupt judges and bent cops and mobsters who thought power came from breaking people. Real power came from principles, from codes, from being someone whose word meant something unbreakable. Years later, in the 1970s, a young law student researching judicial corruption in Manhattan would stumble across inconsistencies in Judge Whitmore's financial records, deposits that didn't match his salary, gaps in the timeline that couldn't be explained, but every lead would hit a dead end. Documents sealed, witnesses deceased or disappeared. The truth preserved in that manila envelope that Bumpy had handed over, kept locked away somewhere only he knew. The law student would eventually give up, frustrated by the wall of silence. She'd never know how close she'd come to uncovering the day a criminal became the only honest man in a courtroom. The story became legend in Harlem, still told today in barbershops and corner stores and late-night gatherings where old-timers educate the young. The story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into a rigged trial and walked out free, not by fighting the system but by understanding it better than the people running it. how he turned a corrupt judge's weapon against him without firing a shot, how he proved that patience and intelligence would always beat brute force and institutional power. See, this is what people don't understand about that era, about those men. They weren't just criminals. They were strategists, philosophers, chess masters playing a game most people couldn't see. Judge Whitmore thought he had the power because he wore the robe, sat behind the bench, controlled the courtroom, but he didn't understand the real game. The game wasn't about legal authority. It was about information, leverage, knowing what someone needed, and being the only person who could provide it. Bumpy understood that, had understood it his entire life. That's why he survived when so many others didn't. That's why his name is still spoken with reverence decades after his death. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond Harlem streets and corrupt judges. It's about how you face systems designed to destroy you. You don't just resist. You don't just fight. You study, you plan, you wait, you find the pressure points, and you apply precision force at the exact right moment. You outlast the chaos. You outlive the betrayals. You become the person who can't be moved because you've built your foundation on something unshakable. Your intelligence, your patience, your word. What would you have done in that courtroom if you were sitting at that defense table watching a judge dismantle your life's work with the stroke of a pen? Would you have had the discipline to wait months, documenting evidence while your empire crumbled? Would you have had the strategic vision to see the long game while you were losing in the short term? Would you have had the restraint to offer mercy instead of revenge when you finally had your enemy cornered? That's the real test. Not whether you can fight. Anyone can throw a punch. The question is whether you can think 3 moves ahead while the world is falling apart around you, whether you can transform a courtroom from a trap into your stage, whether you can turn the law itself into your weapon when the law was designed to bury you. Bumpy Johnson proved it was possible. On March 17, 1952, in a Manhattan courtroom that should have been his end, he showed Harlem and everyone watching that intelligence beats corruption, patience beats power, and truth, even uncomfortable truth about dirty judges and criminal conspiracies, can be the most powerful weapon you'll ever hold. If you found this story as powerful as I did, drop a comment below. What would you have done with that evidence? Would you have offered the deal, or would you have burned it all down? Hit that subscribe button for more stories about the Bart legends who refuse to play by rules designed to destroy them. And remember, the game isn't always about who hits hardest. Sometimes it's about who thinks furthest ahead.